Hello and welcome to Academic English. Today we will focus on CELBAN speaking, and in particular we will discuss probing question number 2, which is the comparison and contrast question. This video will tell you everything you need to know about this question, including how you should organize your answer, what to include in your answer in terms of the criteria that you're marked on, such as the grammar and transition words. So grab a coffee, grab your tea, and let's begin. Some typical questions that you could be asked in this task are living in an apartment compared to living in a house, working in a hospital compared to working in a clinic, using prescription drugs compared to using herbal remedies, losing weight through dieting compared to losing weight through exercise, relieving stress through meditation compared to relieving stress through exercise, traveling within Canada compared to traveling internationally. These are just a few questions, and you can find these questions on the handouts that CELBAN Centre published. And I believe you can purchase these handouts from their website for 75 Canadian dollars each for each skill. So these are some typical questions. Typically, they ask you to compare or contrast two things, general topics, and also you may have to compare something more abstract like policies or attitudes. But typically the questions are not very challenging. So let's begin. Each CELBAN question has the probing questions, they have the same format. So in terms of organization, you want to include an introduction, main points, and conclusion. So they all have 3 components. In terms of the introduction, you typically have to restate the question by using synonyms of the keywords that you find in the question. Now, I say using synonyms because one of the criteria for marking your speaking is vocabulary. So if you want to boost your vocabulary score, an easy way to do this is by using synonyms of the keywords. Then you will have your supporting arguments. In this case, for comparison and contrast, try to discuss both similarities and differences. And then you have your conclusion, which restates the main idea or the main points. It's completely up to you. Now, we're going to dive into each of these components in more detail. So let's start with the introduction. Now, in the introduction, we said you use the keywords from the question to formulate your introduction. And remember to use synonyms if you want to boost that vocabulary score. So now let's look at a sample question. The question says, compare school in Canada with school in the country you come from. So the keywords in the question are school, Canada, school, and the country you come from. Some synonyms for school could be educational institutions, Canada, this country, the country you come from, my country, or say the name of the country. Some examples, you could say there are many similarities and differences between Canada and my country in terms of schooling. If you cannot think of any similarities or any differences, if you cannot talk about both similarities and differences, you could only think of similarities or you could only think of differences, that's okay as well. So you could say, I can only think of differences between these two countries when it comes to educational institutions. This means your answer will only focus on differences. Ideally, they want you to talk about both similarities and differences, but if you cannot think of any, just talk about one side. Another example, you could say the educational institutions in my country are very different, similar, or the same to the ones in Canada. In this case, as you can see, it means that you're mainly talking about similarities. or only talking about similarities. And that's typically how you introduce or how you start your response. Now, in terms of talking about the main points, you can choose if you want to focus on the differences first or the similarities first. You could start with whichever you prefer. And remember that for each main point, including your first main point, you need both a detail or an example following your main point. Now let's be a little bit more specific. So for example, still talking about the subject of schools, if you say one main similarity that I can think of is that the schools in both countries offer the same facilities. You cannot leave it at this. You need to develop a little bit by giving a detail or an example. So if you give a detail, you could say, in other words, educational institutions in Canada and in my country, both have similar classrooms, labs, library, cafeteria, and so on. So this is giving a detail. What do you mean by same facilities? If you talk about an example for that first main point, you could say, to exemplify, during my studies at the nursing college in my country, the labs were just as well equipped as the labs in which I was practicing during my nursing review here in Canada. So you could either give a detail or an example. Don't do both, because your answer will be a little bit too long. So as you can see, for the detail, you give more information on what you stated in your main point. So think about why, how, where, when, who. Think of these questions when you think of developing your answer with a detail. And for an example, it has to be specific, a specific incident, a specific event that you experienced or read about. Now moving on to the second main point, in this case, will be the differences, because we started talking about a similarity. So if your first main point was a similarity, the second one ideally should be a difference. But like I said, if you cannot think of a difference, then talk about another similarity. So in this case, we did think of a difference. So whenever you start going from similarities to differences or from differences to similarities, you need something called a topic shift. This is a transition word that signals to your examiner that you're going to move on in your answer and talk about the other side of the answer. So if you talked about similarities, it signals that you will move on to talk about differences. Some transition words to do this are, on the other hand, however, nevertheless, and there's more, but these are just a few. So you could say something like, that being said, one major difference that comes to mind in regards to schooling between Canada and my country is the tuition cost. So you've noticed that we moved on from similarities, and now we're going to discuss a difference, which is tuition cost. And again, you will need to give a detail and an example to this point. Okay, now the last component of your answer is the conclusion. You could end your response in two ways. First, you could restate your main idea. So basically that's your introduction by using different keywords or synonyms of the keywords. Or you could restate your main points. So our main points were same facilities, but different tuition cost, right? So you could restate that in your conclusion. Let's see some examples. So if you restate the main idea, you're basically repeating the introduction, but you're using different synonyms, and try to use a different sentence structure as well. This way your answer doesn't sound repetitive. So one example could be, If the introduction said there are many similarities and differences between Canada and my country in regards to schools, then in the conclusion you could say, to sum up, educational institutions in these two countries are very similar, but they have some differences as well. And then if you restate your main points, remember the 2 points that you said in your answer and repeat them in the conclusion. So if your similarity was about the facilities and your difference was about tuition cost, then you could conclude, in conclusion, what is similar in regards to schooling between these two countries are the facilities offered, while the difference is the cost of education. Again, these are just examples. Please don't memorize these. Next, let's move on and talk about the grammar of comparison. So the grammar of comparison and contrasts is obviously using comparatives. The way you form comparatives is by using an adjective or an adverb plus er plus than, or by using more or less plus adjective or adverb plus than. Very rarely in the introduction, or if you wanted in the introduction, you could use a superlative, and you form this with the plus adjective or adverb plus est, or the plus most or least plus adjective and adverb. We're going to look at some examples in a little bit. So in terms of the comparatives, what are the rules? You see, you could use er and you could use more or less. I know it's a very simple grammar concept. However, because it's so simple, it's very easy to make mistakes when it comes to it. And through my career, I've seen students at very advanced levels make these simple mistakes in terms of comparatives. So we will look at it a little bit. So for the comparatives, you could have er or you could have most. So let's take a look at some example sentences or example main points in this case. To begin with, the cost of fares on public transit is cheaper in my country than in Canada. So cheaper than. And for superlative, the weather in my country is the most temperate and pleasant. You could use this in the introduction if you wanted to. If you think that something is far superior or better in your country or worse than in Canada. Now, the number one rule for ER or EST in terms of superlatives is that any adjective that only has one syllable would take ER at the end. So cheap becomes cheaper, clean becomes cleaner, and for superlative, the cheapest, the cleanest. Also, any adjective or adverb that is ending in Y also takes ER or EST for the superlative. Busy, it's 2 syllables, but because it ends in Y, it becomes busier, so it takes ER. And the busiest for a superlative. Second rule is that you use more or less, most or least, whenever you have 2 or more syllables for an adjective or adverb. So expensive, it has expensive, 3 syllables. That means you use more or less. So you would say more or less expensive. Or for superlative, the most expensive or the least expensive. Now remember, 2 or more syllables becomes or takes more or less. However, remember we talked about the adjectives ending in Y. If an adjective and an adverb ends in Y, even though it has 2 or 3 syllables, it does not take more or less, it takes ER at the end. And of course, there are some exceptions. Just like with anything in English, you have the few rules and any exceptions. So the first exception is in terms of good. For comparative, it becomes better. Superlative, the best. Bad, comparative, worse. Superlative, the worst. Far becomes farther or further. And for superlative, the farthest, the furthest. Just a pronunciation tip for worse or worst. When you want to use the comparative, sometimes through my experience, students tend to say worst, but they mean comparative. So it should be worse, or the other way around. They say worse instead of saying the worst. Right? And notice that superlative always has an accent. So always, always, always remember to use an accent for superlatives. Okay, now let's talk about the similarities. There are a few expressions that you can use. You could use the same, similar to, as, plus adjective, plus as. So let's look at some examples. You could say first, the textbooks used in nursing college back home are the same as the ones used here in Canada. So this is the main point for the question of talk about schooling, right? This is comparing schooling, and they chose to talk about colleges, or we chose to talk about colleges in this example. The next example is, to begin with, the amount of rainfall here in Vancouver is similar to the one in my hometown. Obviously, this question asked about the weather. And the third one says, one similarity is that the nurse-patient interaction while working in clinics is as empathetic as when working in the hospital. So obviously, this is one example of a main point for the question of comparing working in a hospital with working in clinics. So I gave you some examples so that you can see how to use these expressions in a sentence. But these are the similarity expressions: the same, similar to, as, plus adjective, plus as. And now that we talked about the grammar of comparison, let's talk about transitions. Just as grammar is one of the criteria for scoring, and one point to notice about grammar is, or to note about grammar, is that for scoring your grammar, every point that you get, it's actually 2 points. So grammar is worth twice as heavy when they score your speaking. So for transition words, which is another criteria in evaluating your speaking, you should use transition words when you start discussing a new point, when you're providing a detail, when you're giving an example, or when you're starting the conclusion. So let's break it down. When you start a main point, you could say, to begin with, one similarity or difference is. The first similarity I could think of is, on the one hand. For the second point, you could say, another similarity or difference is. On the other hand, you could say, however, or nevertheless. In terms of details and examples, so for details, you could say, in other words, what I mean is, in fact, indeed, and then you will explain. And for examples, to exemplify, for example, a classic example is, for instance. So remember, you use these transition words at the beginning of the sentence, and then your sentence will follow. In terms of the conclusion or the wrap up, you could say, to conclude, in conclusion, to sum up, in a nutshell, all in all, in short, or to summarize. And of course, there's some other ones that you could use. You could use so. I personally think it's slightly too informal, but you could use it if you cannot think of any other transition. And that is everything you need to know about CELBAN speaking, the comparison question. Now, if you have any questions, you can mention them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. Also, please like and share, subscribe if you want to find out more information about CELBAN. Our next video will be next week on a different aspect or component of the CELBAN exam. And our goal is to upload every week a new video that educates you on the CELBAN. Let me know if you have any questions below and I'll see you next week. Bye bye.